Here's something they definitely didn't teach you in school. In 1860, the total value of enslaved people in the United States was $3.5 billion. To put that in perspective, that was more valuable than all of America's railroads, banks, and factories combined. Enslaved human beings were literally the country's biggest financial asset, $3.5 billion. In today's money, that's somewhere around $4 to $5 trillion. And here's the crazy part. When Abraham Lincoln proposed the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, he also proposed compensating slaveholders for their lost property, not the enslaved people, the slaveholders. The math? $400 million to pay off Southern plantation owners. That's the equivalent of roughly $15 billion today. America literally debated writing a check to slave owners because freeing human beings would crash the economy. This isn't some fringe conspiracy theory. This is straight from the historical record, and it reveals something uncomfortable about the so-called American dream. This country didn't build its wealth through hard work and innovation alone. It built it through stolen labor, stolen land, and a financial system specifically designed to extract maximum value from human suffering. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the real economic story of America, the story they gloss over in textbooks. The story that explains why wealth inequality today looks almost identical to what it looked like in 1890. The story that connects your student loans to plantation mortgages, your credit card debt to company store script, and your rent payments to the very first American real estate scam. How did America actually get rich? Buckle up. This one's going to sting. Look, I'm not here to make you feel guilty about history. That's not productive. What I am here to do is show you how the economic systems that built this country are still running today. They just look different. And understanding that is the key to understanding why you might be struggling financially, even though you're doing everything right. Here's what you're going to learn in the next 20 minutes. First, we're going to break down the 3 economic engines that actually built American wealth, and none of them are entrepreneurship or innovation. Second, I'm going to show you the specific financial instruments, mortgages, stocks, bonds, that were invented to trade human beings, and how those exact same instruments are being used on you right now. Third, we'll look at how the Gilded Age created the blueprint for modern inequality, and why Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are basically just new versions of Carnegie and Rockefeller. Stick around until the end, because I'm going to reveal the one economic pattern that's repeated itself 4 times in American history, and we're watching it happen again right now in 2024. Once you see this pattern, you cannot unsee it. It'll change how you look at everything from housing prices to cryptocurrency to your own bank account. But first, we need to go back to the very beginning. Not 1776. Not Plymouth Rock. We're going back to 1619, to a port in Virginia, where 20 enslaved Africans stepped off a ship called the White Lion. Because that moment, not the Declaration of Independence, not the Constitution, that moment is when the American economy was truly born. Let's travel back 400 years and follow the money. Picture Virginia in 1619. It's basically a disaster. The Jamestown colony has been around for 12 years and it's hemorrhaging money. The investors back in London are furious. They sent colonists to find gold, establish trade routes, and get rich quick. Instead, people keep dying. Of the roughly 6,000 colonists who arrived between 1607 and 1624, about 4,800 of them died. That's an 80% mortality rate. The Virginia Company of London is on the verge of bankruptcy. Then, 2 things happen that change everything. First, a colonist named John Rolfe figures out how to grow a strain of tobacco that Europeans actually want to smoke. Before this, Virginia tobacco tasted terrible. But Rolfe gets his hands on seeds from Spanish colonies, and suddenly, Virginia has a product. By 1617, Virginia is exporting 20,000 pounds of tobacco. By 1622, it's 60,000 pounds. By 1628, it's over 500,000 pounds. The investors are finally making money. But here's the problem. Tobacco destroys the soil. After 3 or 4 harvests, the land is basically dead. You need fresh land constantly, and tobacco is incredibly labor-intensive. One worker can only tend about 2 or 3 acres. To make real money, you need massive amounts of both land and labor. The land part was relatively easy. Just take it from the Powhatan Confederacy, which the colonists did through a series of wars and treaties that pushed indigenous peoples further and further from their ancestral territories. By 1650, the colonists controlled most of eastern Virginia. But labor? That was harder. English laborers weren't exactly lining up to work themselves to death in a disease-ridden swamp. So the colonists developed a system called indentured servitude. Poor English people would sell 4 to 7 years of their labor in exchange for passage to America. Between 1630 and 1680, roughly 75,000 indentured servants came to Virginia and Maryland. Here's where it gets interesting economically. Indentured servants were expensive. You had to feed them, house them, and at the end of their term, you owed them freedom dues. Land, tools, sometimes cash. And here's the thing. They eventually became free. They became competition. Enslaved Africans, on the other hand, were a permanent investment. Yes, the upfront cost was higher, roughly twice the price of an indentured servant, but they never became free. Their children were automatically enslaved, and because American law increasingly defined slavery as hereditary and race-based, there was no danger they'd ever become competition. Between 1680 and 1720, the Chesapeake region underwent a massive transformation. The percentage of workers who were enslaved jumped from about 7% to 44%. By the time of the Revolution, Virginia alone had nearly 300,000 enslaved people, 40% of the entire colonial population. This wasn't just farming. This was the birth of American capitalism. And understanding that changes everything about what comes next. Now here's where we need to follow the money, because the economics get wild. By the mid-17th century, enslaved people weren't just laborers. They were America's primary form of wealth. Think about that. In a world without stocks, without 401s, without most of the financial instruments we use today, wealth had to be stored somewhere. In Europe, it was mostly land. In America, it was humans. And American colonists got extremely creative about turning human beings into liquid capital. The first innovation was the slave mortgage. Yes, mortgage, just like the one on your house. Starting in the early 1700s, plantation owners began using enslaved people as collateral for loans. Need money to expand your operation? Put up your enslaved workers as security. Banks in London, Amsterdam, and eventually New York were happy to lend against this property. By 1860, over $4 billion in modern value was locked up in mortgages on enslaved people. Enslaved people could be mortgaged, sold, inherited, seized for debt, or split between heirs like any other asset. There are records of enslaved families being divided up in wills the same way you might divide furniture. The second innovation was the slave-backed bond. This is where it gets really Wall Street. Starting in the 1830s, Southern banks began issuing bonds backed by pools of enslaved people. Here's how it worked. A bank would bundle together hundreds or thousands of mortgages on enslaved people, then sell bonds to investors. The investors got regular interest payments, and the bonds could be traded on markets in London and New York. Sound familiar? It should. This is essentially the same structure as the mortgage-backed securities that crashed the economy in 2008. The technology of securitization, turning individual loans into tradable financial instruments, was pioneered using human beings as the underlying asset. By 1860, American slavery had evolved into a sophisticated financial system with international reach. Banks in London were financing plantation purchases in Mississippi. Investors in Amsterdam were collecting interest payments extracted from cotton picked by enslaved people in Alabama. The Atlantic economy was built on this system, and cotton was the engine driving all of it. Between 1800 and 1860, cotton production in the American South increased by over 8,000%. By 1840, cotton represented over half of all American exports. By 1860, the South was producing 3/4 of the world's cotton supply. Britain's entire textile industry, the heart of the Industrial Revolution, depended on Southern cotton. The numbers are staggering. In 1860, the 4 million enslaved people in the South were worth an estimated $3.5 billion. That was more than all American manufacturing combined, more than all the railroads, more than all the banks. Enslaved human beings were literally the largest financial asset in the entire American economy, and the wealth extraction was relentless. Enslaved workers in cotton fields were forced to pick between 150 and 200 pounds of cotton per day. The methods used to ensure this productivity were brutal: systematic torture, family separation as punishment, sexual violence as a tool of control. Economic efficiency was extracted through maximum cruelty. The profits from this system didn't just stay in the South. Northern banks financed the operations. Northern textile mills processed the cotton. Northern shipping companies transported it. A study by Harvard economists found that nearly half of all cotton profits ended up in Northern hands. New York City's early economic dominance was built significantly on handling Southern cotton trade. This was the first great wealth accumulation in American history, and it created a problem that would define everything that came after. What happens when your entire economy is built on something unsustainable? Remember that. It's going to come back. Here's where the economics of empire start to turn ugly. Because slavery had a fundamental economic problem that nobody wanted to talk about. The system needed constant expansion. Remember how tobacco destroyed the soil? Cotton did the same thing, just slower. After 15 to 20 years of continuous cotton farming, land became significantly less productive. You needed fresh land, constantly. And that meant expansion westward, into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. This is why every political fight in antebellum America was really about one thing. Would new territories allow slavery? It wasn't just about morality. It was about whether the Southern economic model could survive. Without new land, the whole system would eventually collapse under its own soil exhaustion. Between 1790 and 1860, the enslaved population shifted dramatically westward. In 1790, most enslaved people lived in Virginia and Maryland. By 1860, the center had moved to Alabama and Mississippi. Over 1 million enslaved people were forcibly relocated through the domestic slave trade, sold away from their families, marched hundreds of miles to new plantations. And here's the economic irony. All this expansion made enslaved people more valuable, not less. Between 1800 and 1860, the average price of an enslaved person roughly tripled. Young, healthy men who sold for around $500 in 1800 were selling for $1,500 to $2,000 by 1860. Adjusted for inflation, that's like going from $15,000 to $50,000. This created a financial trap. Southern wealth was increasingly tied up in human property, but the productivity of that property depended on access to fresh land. When it became clear that slavery would not be allowed to expand into Kansas, into the Western territories, Southern elites saw the writing on the wall. Their entire economic system was facing a slow-motion collapse. This is why the Civil War happened. Not because of abstract debates about states' rights, but because the slave economy had reached its territorial limits and the asset bubble was about to pop. And when the war came, it revealed just how fragile the whole system was. The Confederacy had massive paper wealth, all those enslaved people, all that cotton. But paper wealth isn't the same as productive capacity. The South had almost no industrial base, almost no railroads compared to the North, almost no banking infrastructure. They had been so focused on extracting wealth from labor that they'd never built the capacity to produce wealth through manufacturing. 4 years of war destroyed roughly 2/3 of Southern wealth. The emancipation of 4 million enslaved people wiped out that $3.5 billion asset base overnight. Confederate bonds and currency became worthless. Land values crashed. It was the biggest destruction of wealth in American history until the Great Depression. But here's what they don't tell you. This wasn't the end of the extraction economy. It was a transition. Because the people who had built the slave system immediately started building new systems to achieve the same results through different means. The period right after the Civil War is one of the most important and most misunderstood in American economic history. Because what happened wasn't a new economy replacing the old one. It was the old extraction economy putting on new clothes. Let's follow the money again. After the war, southern plantations still needed labor, and the formerly enslaved people still needed to survive. But they owned nothing. No land, no tools, no savings. The famous promise of 40 acres and a mule was almost entirely abandoned. Only about 30,000 black families received any land at all, and most of that was later taken back. So, a new system emerged: sharecropping. Here's how it worked. A formerly enslaved person would rent land from a plantation owner, usually the same one who had owned them. They'd pay rent not in cash, but as a share of their crop, typically 50%. But they also needed tools, seed, food to survive until harvest. Those they'd buy on credit from the plantation owner's store at marked up prices with interest. Do the math. 50% of your crop goes to rent. Another 20 to 30% goes to pay off your debt at the company store. You're left with almost nothing. And if you can't pay off your debt, you're legally obligated to stay and work it off. It was slavery without the name. By 1880, over 80% of black farmers in the South were sharecroppers or tenant farmers. Many white farmers got trapped in the same system. The new bondage was debt, not chains. But the economic extraction was almost identical. At the same time, a new kind of economy was emerging in the North, built on the same principles of extraction and concentration. The railroads needed building, steel needed making, oil needed drilling, and a new generation of industrial titans figured out how to concentrate wealth on a scale never before seen in human history. Between 1870 and 1900, American GDP more than tripled. The country went from an agricultural economy to the world's leading industrial power. Cities exploded. Chicago went from 300,000 people to 1.7 million in 30 years. Immigration flooded the labor market. Over 12 million people arrived between 1870 and 1900. And here's the thing. Almost none of this wealth went to the workers. In 1890, the richest 1% of Americans owned 51% of all wealth. The bottom 44% owned 1.2%. That's not a typo. Nearly half the population controlled barely more than 1% of the wealth. John D. Rockefeller controlled 90% of American oil refining. Andrew Carnegie dominated steel. J.P. Morgan controlled the banks. These men had more personal wealth than many European nations. How did they do it? The same playbook the plantation owners used: extract maximum value from labor while paying minimum possible wages. Crush competition through monopoly power. Use debt to trap workers. Buy the political system to make it all legal. Steel workers in Pittsburgh worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, in conditions so dangerous that 1 in 11 workers was injured every year. When they tried to organize, Carnegie hired Pinkerton agents who killed strikers at Homestead in 1892. Railroad workers faced similar conditions. The Great Railroad Strikes of 1877 saw over 100 workers killed by state militias. This was the Gilded Age. Gold plating on a rotten core. Now here's where we bring it all together. Because everything I just described, it's happening again. Right now. To you. Let's look at the patterns. Pattern 1. Wealth concentrated in assets that most people can't access. In 1860, enslaved people were the largest asset class, and only wealthy white Southerners could own them. Today, stocks and real estate are the largest asset classes, and ownership is increasingly concentrated. The top 10% own 89% of all stocks. The top 1% owns more wealth than the entire middle class combined. In 2022, the richest 1% of Americans owned 32% of all wealth. The bottom 50% owned 2.6%. Those numbers look almost identical to 1890. Pattern 2. Debt as a tool of control. Sharecroppers were trapped by debt to the company store. Today, Americans carry over $1 trillion in credit card debt. Student loan debt is $1.7 trillion. Medical debt is a leading cause of bankruptcy. The average American pays over $4,000 per year just in interest. Here's the kicker. Real wages for working Americans have barely budged since 1970, while productivity has nearly doubled. Where did all that increased value go? Same place it always goes. Up. Pattern 3. Extract maximum labor value while paying minimum wages. In 1890, steel workers made about $1.50 per day, while Carnegie made $400,000 per day in profits. Today, the median Amazon warehouse worker makes about $35,000 per year, while Bezos' net worth increased by over $70 billion in 2020 alone. That's not innovation. That's extraction. Same system, new technology. Pattern 4. Financialization of everything. Remember those slave-backed bonds? The technique of turning income streams into tradable securities has only accelerated. Your mortgage is bundled and sold. Your student loans are securitized. Your rent payments are packaged into REITs. Your data is harvested and monetized. You are the product being financialized. And here's the pattern that keeps repeating. Extreme wealth concentration always leads to political instability. The 1890s saw populist revolts, labor strikes, assassination attempts on industrialists. Sound familiar? When regular people can't get ahead, no matter how hard they work, they start looking for alternatives. Let me give you the one economic principle I promised at the beginning. It's this. Every American economic boom has been built on some form of extraction, taking value from people who can't fight back. First, it was enslaved people. Then, it was sharecroppers and industrial workers. Now, it's the entire working and middle class, through debt and asset inflation. The names change. The addresses change. The fundamental economics don't. Your student loans? That's you paying tribute to the education financial complex, the same way a sharecropper paid tribute to the plantation owner. Your rent going up while wages stay flat? That's value extraction. Your gig economy job with no benefits? That's the company store, digitized. The question isn't whether this system will change. History tells us concentrated extraction always collapses eventually, through reform, revolution, or catastrophic breakdown. The question is what replaces it, and whether you'll be ready. So let's bring it home. Here's what we learned about how America actually got rich. First, American wealth was originally built on enslaved labor. Full stop. That $3.5 billion in human property was the seed capital for American capitalism, and the financial instruments created to trade humans. Mortgages, bonds, securitization became the foundation of modern finance. Second, when one extraction system ends, it gets replaced by another. Slavery became sharecropping. Sharecropping became industrial wage slavery. Industrial exploitation evolved into financial extraction through debt and asset inflation. The technology changes, the extraction continues. Third, extreme wealth concentration is not a bug, it's a feature. The Gilded Age and today look remarkably similar because they're running the same program. When 1% controls most of the wealth, that's not capitalism malfunctioning. That's capitalism functioning exactly as the people at the top designed it. And fourth, here's the one principle that predicts empire collapse. When an economy becomes more about extracting value than creating it, collapse becomes inevitable. Spain extracted gold until they went broke. Britain extracted from colonies until the empire crumbled. The question is whether America will learn from history or repeat it. So, what do you do with this information? Start by understanding the game. Every financial product, every economic policy, ask yourself, who's extracting value from whom? Follow the money. See the patterns. If this video changed how you see things, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. I'm dropping videos every week breaking down the real economics they don't teach in school. Next week, we're diving into how the Federal Reserve actually works and why your money loses value while billionaires get richer. You're not going to want to miss that one. Remember, empires don't fall because of enemies at the gates. They fall because of rot within the walls. Know the history. See the present. Prepare for what's coming. I'll see you in the next one.